Leningrad was surrounded in the north, Kiev had fallen in the south, and only Moscow remained as the final symbol of resistance. For Hitler, the Soviet capital was more than a strategic objective. It was the ideological heart of Bolshevism. Capturing it meant not only crippling Soviet command and control, but also dealing a psychological blow to the Red Army and the Soviet people. On September 6, 1941, Hitler issued Directive No. 35, ordering Operation Typhoon, the final offensive intended to encircle and destroy the remaining Soviet forces in front of Moscow and seize the city before the onset of winter. The operation would involve Army Group Center, North and South, but the primary thrust came from Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock. At its core, the German plan called for two massive encirclements west of Moscow, one near Vyazma and another around Bryansk, designed to annihilate Soviet forces defending the approaches to the capital. The main strike groups consisted of four panzer armies under Generals Heinz Guderian, Hermann Hoth, Erich Hübner, and Adolf Strauss. Together, they fielded roughly 1.9 million men, 1,000 tanks, and 14,000 artillery pieces. Luftflotte 2, under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, provided over 1,000 aircraft for air superiority and close support. The operations planners calculated that Moscow could be reached within 4 weeks, well before the harsh Russian winter would set in. The Red Army, however, was far from defeated. Despite suffering catastrophic losses, over 3 million men captured since June, the Soviets still managed to raise new armies and establish successive defensive lines along the approaches to Moscow. The newly formed Western Reserve and Bryansk fronts were commanded by Generals Ivan Konev, Semyon Budyonny, and Andrei Yeremenko, respectively. Behind them, the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, led by Joseph Stalin and Marshal Georgy Zhukov, began preparing fallback defenses directly around the capital. Soviet intelligence had intercepted German communications suggesting a renewed offensive, but the precise timing and strength of the operation remained unclear. The terrain around Moscow presented a formidable challenge to mechanized warfare. The region was marked by dense forests, swampy lowlands, and a poorly developed road network that turned to mud during the autumn rains. Nevertheless, the Germans believed speed and surprise would offset these obstacles. The logistical planning of the operation relied heavily on the assumption that captured Soviet railways and depots would sustain the advancing troops. Yet, in reality, supply lines were already overstretched, and fuel shortages had begun to cripple the mobility of panzer divisions even before the offensive began. As September gave way to October, the weather began to deteriorate rapidly. Heavy rains transformed the unpaved roads into rivers of mud, a condition the Germans referred to as Rasputitsa, the infamous season of impassable terrain. Vehicles became mired axle-deep, horses collapsed from exhaustion, and supply convoys stalled for days. Commanders urged the High Command to delay the offensive until conditions improved, but Hitler insisted on immediate action. He was determined to deliver the decisive blow before the winter froze the front solid. By late September 1941, both armies were locked in a contest of endurance rather than strategy. The Germans had reached the limits of their momentum, but they still possessed tactical superiority and initiative. The Soviets, though battered, had learned valuable lessons from earlier defeats: flexibility, defense in depth, and the strategic use of reserves. The stage was set for the final struggle over Moscow, a confrontation that would test not only the armies, but the limits of human survival itself. Operation Typhoon officially began on October 2, 1941. As the fog lifted from the fields of Smolensk, German artillery thundered along a 600-kilometer front. The sound of engines and the rumble of tanks marked the start of what Hitler called the decisive battle of the war. Few among the German High Command doubted success. The Red Army, in their view, was already broken. It simply had to be finished off. Yet, as the first snowflakes began to fall over the central Russian plain, the myth of blitzkrieg supremacy would soon meet its most formidable adversary. Not the Soviet guns, but the Russian winter itself. The offensive began with overwhelming force. At dawn on October 2, 1941, a massive artillery barrage erupted along the front lines west of Moscow, followed by the advance of armored spearheads through the positions of the Soviet Bryansk, Western, and Reserve fronts. The German 2nd Panzer Army under Guderian attacked from the south, moving toward Orel and Bryansk, while Hoth's 3rd Panzer Army and Höppner's 4th Panzer Army struck from the north toward Vyazma. Their goal was to converge east of Smolensk, encircling the Soviet armies defending the approaches to the capital. Within days, the German panzers broke through the thin Soviet lines, exploiting gaps created by poor coordination and inadequate reserves. By October 5th, Guderian's armored columns had advanced nearly 200 kilometers, capturing Orel on the 3rd and threatening Bryansk by the 6th. In the north, Hoth's forces encircled large Soviet formations around Vyazma, trapping over 600,000 soldiers. Communication between the Soviet fronts collapsed as telephone lines were destroyed and radio networks disrupted. Entire divisions were cut off from supply and retreat. The German command reported an unprecedented victory, claiming that Moscow lay open for the taking. The encircled Soviet troops, however, did not surrender easily. For more than 10 days they fought from forest strongholds and villages, delaying the German advance and forcing the Wehrmacht to divert critical armor and fuel to maintain the encirclement. The Soviet High Command, faced with the rapid collapse of the Western and Reserve fronts, replaced Konev with Zhukov on October 10th. Zhukov immediately ordered the establishment of successive defensive lines, the Mozhaisk line, stretching from Kaluga to Volokholamsk, and the Istra line closer to Moscow. Over 90,000 civilians from the capital were mobilized to dig trenches, anti-tank ditches, and fortifications. Factories in Moscow shifted to round-the-clock production of weapons and ammunition, while military academies evacuated eastward. At the same time, Stalin refused to abandon the capital, declaring that Moscow will be defended to the last drop of blood. His decision to remain in the city had both practical and symbolic importance, reinforcing morale and unity within a country teetering on the edge of collapse. German intelligence underestimated the Soviet ability to reorganize under pressure. The Red Army's fragmented units regrouped east of Vyazma, forming new defensive clusters that slowed the German advance. Despite enormous losses, approximately 673,000 men captured or killed in the Vyazma and Bryansk pockets, the Soviets still fielded fresh reserves from Siberia and the Far East, where divisions had been released following Japanese assurances of neutrality under the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact. These reinforcements, better equipped for cold weather, would later prove decisive. By mid-October, German forces reached the outskirts of Kaluga, Maloyaroslavets, and Mozhaisk. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, bombing transport hubs and railways leading into Moscow. Yet the pace of the offensive was slowing. Heavy rain had turned roads into mud, immobilizing tanks and trucks. Each kilometer toward Moscow came at the cost of mounting mechanical failures and fuel shortages. Soldiers described advancing knee-deep in clay, while horses, still responsible for most of the German supply transport, died by the thousands. Units reported that food rations were running low, and winter uniforms had yet to arrive from Germany. Meanwhile, the civilian population of Moscow endured a growing sense of dread. On October 15th, the Soviet government initiated partial evacuations, relocating ministries, archives, and industrial plants to Kuibyshev and Sverdlovsk. Panic spread when rumors emerged that the Germans had broken through to the city's western suburbs. Looting and desertions followed, prompting the NKVD to impose martial law. Over 2,000 alleged deserters and looters were executed within days. Despite the chaos, by late October, discipline was restored, and the Red Army continued to reinforce defensive positions around the city. The German High Command, believing that the final capture of Moscow was imminent, launched a new phase of the offensive on October 15th, known as the Battle for the Mozhaisk Line. The 4th Panzer Group attacked from the northwest toward Volokholamsk, while Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army attempted to encircle Tula from the south. The fighting was fierce and costly. Soviet divisions, though outgunned, fought with desperation. The 316th Rifle Division under General Ivan Panfilov held Volokholamsk for over 2 weeks, inflicting heavy casualties and becoming one of the symbolic defenders of Moscow. By the end of October, the weather turned decisively against the Germans. Temperatures dropped below freezing at night, and the first snowfalls began to cover the roads. Vehicles without antifreeze froze solid, fuel congealed in storage drums, and machine guns jammed. The Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg, once unstoppable, was grinding to a halt. Still, Hitler and his generals refused to accept reality. On November 15th, they ordered one final push toward Moscow, believing that victory remained within reach if only the city could be taken before the full onset of winter. What they failed to recognize was that the Soviet defense was hardening, and the invaders were now fighting both the Red Army and the Russian climate, a duel no army in modern history had ever survived. The renewed German offensive, launched on November 15, 1941, marked the final and most desperate attempt to seize Moscow before winter fully closed in. Operation Typhoon entered its second phase, with Army Group Center reorganized for one decisive thrust. The plan called for Hauptner's 4th Panzer Army to advance along the northern axis through Klin and Solnechno-Gorsk, while Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army would attack from the south toward Kashira, encircling the capital from both directions. In the center, Strauss's 9th Army and Klug's 4th Army would tie down Soviet forces through frontal assaults. Despite logistical collapse and worsening weather, Hitler demanded the continuation of the offensive, insisting that the enemy is at his last gasp. By this time, German combat strength had been severely depleted. Of the 1.9 million men who began the operation in early October, fewer than 1.3 million remained effective by mid-November. Panzer divisions averaged only 40 to 60 operational tanks each, compared to over 200 in June. Fuel and ammunition were critically short, with some divisions receiving less than half their daily requirement. The troops lacked winter uniforms, relying on improvised coverings from captured Soviet clothing or blankets. Frostbite had become a greater threat than Soviet bullets. Medical units reported over 100,000 non-combat casualties caused by exposure before December began. Nevertheless, the offensive initially achieved tactical success. On the northern front, Hauptner's forces broke through the Soviet 30th Army, capturing Klin on November 23rd and reaching the Moscow-Volga Canal. For a brief moment, German reconnaissance units could see the faint glow of the capital's lights on the horizon. To the south, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army captured Venev and advanced toward Kashira, threatening to cut off Tula, where fierce urban combat raged. The Soviets countered with reinforcements from the 10th and 50th Armies, preventing the Germans from closing the encirclement. Despite losing ground, Soviet defensive cohesion was improving. Each kilometer gained by the Germans now required days of fighting and mounting losses. The Soviet High Command, recognizing the gravity of the situation, rushed additional troops from the eastern districts. Between mid-November and early December, 7 Siberian divisions, 2 tank brigades, and over 1,000 T-34 and KV-1 tanks arrived at the Moscow front. These units, commanded by experienced officers and equipped for sub-zero warfare, were fresh and well supplied. Their deployment was made possible by intelligence from Richard Sorge, a Soviet spy in Tokyo, who confirmed that Japan would not attack the USSR in 1941. This allowed Stalin to transfer his eastern reserves westward without risking the Far East. As temperatures plunged to 20 degrees, combat on both sides reached a level of attrition unseen since the opening weeks of the invasion. Engines failed to start, artillery shells froze to their racks, and wounded soldiers perished within minutes if left unattended. German troops burned vehicle fuel to stay warm, consuming the very resource needed to advance. Horses, numbering over 600,000 in Army Group Center, began dying at an accelerating rate, paralyzing supply transport. In contrast, Soviet logistics benefited from shorter supply routes, with Moscow functioning as both a defensive stronghold and a production hub. Thousands of women and civilians labored under bombardment to repair roads, dig anti-tank trenches, and deliver ammunition to the front lines. On the German side, morale began to erode. Soldiers recorded in letters and diaries their disbelief at the scale of the cold and the endless waves of Soviet reinforcements. Many referred to the campaign as the White Hell, describing frostbitten comrades whose rifles stuck to their hands. Commanders struggled to maintain discipline as exhaustion and hunger spread through the ranks. Hitler's refusal to authorize retreat deepened resentment within the officer corps. Several generals, including Guderian, privately warned that continued attacks were futile. Yet on November 27th, Hitler issued a direct order to persevere, declaring that the Russian Colossus is at the point of collapse. One final effort will bring victory. Soviet resistance along the Mojaysk and Istra lines stiffened under Zhukov's direction. Using a defense-in-depth strategy, Soviet forces absorbed German advances, counterattacking at critical junctures to delay encirclement. In the north, fierce fighting erupted around Krasnaya Poliana and Yakroma, where the Germans reached within 25 kilometers of Moscow. In the south, Guderian's forces were halted at Tula, where Soviet defenders repelled repeated tank assaults despite being outnumbered 2-1. The 239th Rifle Division and local militia units fought house to house, using Molotov cocktails and anti-tank rifles to disable German armor. By the beginning of December, the German offensive had stalled completely. The Wehrmacht had advanced to within 20 kilometers of the Kremlin but could advance no farther. Snowstorms, supply exhaustion, and Soviet counterfire froze the front into immobility. At night, the gunfire fell silent, replaced by the howling wind sweeping across the frozen plains. For the first time since the invasion began, German troops dug defensive positions, a silent admission that the initiative had passed to the Red Army. On December 2nd, a reconnaissance detachment from the 258th Infantry Division planted a flag at Khimki, the closest German position to Moscow, before retreating under Soviet artillery fire. It would mark the high water point of Operation Typhoon. Within days, temperatures fell below 30 degrees Celsius, and the long-feared Russian winter descended in full force. The battle for Moscow was not yet over, but the fate of Hitler's empire had already begun to turn beneath the ice. On December 5, 1941, the German advance toward Moscow came to an abrupt end. That morning, Soviet artillery opened fire along a 1,000-kilometer front, the signal for the start of the Red Army's massive counteroffensive. For the first time since the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet forces went on the attack. The counterstrike was commanded by Zhukov and supported by Generals Konev, Rokossovsky, and Govorov, each responsible for a section of the defense perimeter around Moscow. Approximately 1.1 million Soviet troops, 7,700 artillery pieces, and 1,000 tanks participated in the operation, confronting a German force of barely 900,000 exhausted and frostbitten soldiers who were now on the defensive. The offensive began simultaneously from the northern and southern flanks. In the north, the 30th and 1st Shock Armies attacked toward Klin and Kalinin, threatening to cut off the spearheads of the 3rd and 4th Panzer Armies. In the south, the 10th, 49th, and 50th Armies struck toward Tula and Kaluga, pushing against Guderian's overstretched formations. Within hours, German positions began to crumble under the combined pressure of artillery barrages, tank assaults, and relentless infantry waves. The Wehrmacht, ill-prepared for defense, found its forward units isolated and unable to retreat due to a lack of fuel and mobility. Temperatures dropped to 35 degrees Celsius, immobilizing machinery and freezing weapons. Soviet soldiers, better equipped with felt boots, padded jackets, and gloves, endured the conditions more effectively than their opponents. German units lacked antifreeze, causing engines to crack, and rifles malfunctioned as lubricants solidified. In some divisions, frostbite casualties exceeded combat losses. Despite these conditions, Soviet momentum continued to build. On December 7th, the same day Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, German command posts near Klin and Istra began reporting total disintegration of the front. The offensive coincided with the global expansion of the war, connecting the battles outside Moscow with events that would soon engulf the entire world. Zhukov's plan exploited the overextension of German supply lines. The Red Army aimed not merely to repel the enemy, but to destroy key formations caught in forward positions. Soviet cavalry units played an unexpected role, operating in deep snow where tanks could not maneuver. In the Kalinin sector, General Belov's cavalry corps cut behind German lines, disrupting communications and capturing supply depots. At the same time, partisan activity intensified across the occupied regions, ambushing retreating convoys and sabotaging railways. These actions compounded the logistical crisis already paralyzing Army Group Center. Hitler's insistence on holding ground at all costs created chaos among field commanders. When Field Marshal von Bock requested permission to withdraw to more defensible positions, Hitler refused, declaring that the German soldier must stand fast or the Reich will perish. This order condemned many units to encirclement. The 3rd Panzer Army near Klin and the 2nd Panzer Army near Tula narrowly escaped destruction only by abandoning large quantities of equipment. Soviet forces recaptured Klin on December 15th, followed by Kalinin 2 days later. In the south, Guderian's troops were forced to retreat from Tula toward Orel, losing up to 40% of their combat strength in the process. For the German troops, the retreat was a nightmare. Roads were blocked by wrecked vehicles and dead horses. Soldiers trudged through waist-deep snow, dragging wounded comrades on sleds. Supply depots were abandoned or burned to prevent capture. Luftwaffe transports attempted to drop food and ammunition, but many planes failed to reach their targets due to freezing engines. Entire divisions disintegrated into small groups struggling to survive. The German Fourth Army reported 80,000 frostbite cases in December alone, while more than 130,000 troops were lost as killed, missing, or captured during the first 2 weeks of the Soviet counteroffensive. Soviet propaganda celebrated the reversal as a national triumph. Moscow newspapers proclaimed, "The enemy is frozen to death before our walls." Radio broadcasts boasted that the Red Army had shattered the myth of German invincibility. For the Soviet population, the victory provided the first tangible sign that the war could still be won. Civilian morale, which had reached its lowest point in October, now soared. Stalin publicly addressed the nation on December 6th, stating, "The hour of retribution has struck. The enemy has met his master." His presence in Moscow throughout the crisis had been a calculated act of defiance, transforming him into a symbol of endurance and control. German command tried to stabilize the situation by forming new defensive lines along the Lama, Nara, and Oka rivers, but the Soviet advance proved relentless. By late December, the Red Army recaptured Kaluga, Maloyaroslavets, and Mojaisk, pushing the front back over 100 kilometers from the capital. The German dream of capturing Moscow was shattered. Even more damaging than the territorial loss was the psychological blow. The Wehrmacht, which had conquered Europe in less than 2 years, now faced its first major defeat. The illusion of a short, decisive campaign against the Soviet Union was gone forever. Despite the success of the counteroffensive, Soviet commanders recognized the immense cost. Their own losses were staggering, over 370,000 casualties in December 1941 alone. Units that had begun the attack with full strength were once again depleted. Tanks broke down from overuse, and ammunition shortages loomed. Yet the momentum remained with the Red Army. For the first time since June, Soviet troops were advancing, not retreating, and the German invaders were no longer unstoppable. The Battle of Moscow had turned the tide of the war, transforming a seemingly doomed defense into a symbol of resistance that would define the rest of the Eastern Front. The German retreat did not end with the onset of the new year. As January 1942 began, Soviet forces pushed forward once more, seeking to exploit the disarray of Army Group Center. What began as a desperate defense of the capital had evolved into a pursuit that would drag both armies into the frozen depths of the Russian winter, a campaign where endurance, not strategy, would decide who survived. By January 1942, the battlefield west of Moscow had transformed into a frozen wasteland littered with wreckage, corpses, and abandoned vehicles. The Red Army's counteroffensive, though successful in halting and repelling the Wehrmacht, had now evolved into a grueling winter campaign. Stalin and the Stavka believed the German army was on the verge of total collapse. Encouraged by the victories around Kaluga, Klin, and Tula, Soviet leadership ordered a series of ambitious follow-up offensives aimed at annihilating Army Group Center. The objective was no longer merely to push the Germans away from Moscow, but to destroy them outright, to end the war in 1942. The Soviet plan was vast and optimistic. In the north, General Konev's Kalinin front was to advance toward Rzhev and Vyazma. In the center, Zhukov's western front would strike directly westward, and in the south, General Yeremenko's Bryansk front would move toward Oral. In total, the Soviets committed more than 1.6 million troops, supported by over 7,500 tanks and 20,000 artillery pieces. However, the Red Army faced the same challenges that had crippled the Germans only weeks before. Supply routes stretched over hundreds of kilometers of frozen terrain, and the newly mobilized Soviet divisions lacked training, coordination, and adequate winter gear. Many units operated with only a fraction of their authorized equipment. The offensive began in early January under extreme weather conditions, with temperatures falling below 40 degrees Celsius. Artillery pieces froze to their carriages, and engines required fires lit beneath them before they could start. Soviet soldiers advanced on skis, sleds, and even on foot through waist-deep snow. Their determination was undeniable, but the logistical difficulties quickly slowed momentum. Communications often failed, leaving divisions isolated. Ammunition deliveries were delayed by days, and medical evacuation was almost impossible. Despite these hardships, the Soviets made impressive initial gains, driving the Germans back another 100 to 150 kilometers in some sectors. The German army, though severely weakened, was far from defeated. By January 10th, the High Command had stabilized much of the front through emergency defensive measures. Hitler had dismissed Field Marshal von Bock and replaced him with Günther von Kluge, ordering him to hold every position to the last man. The Führer's no-retreat directive transformed the front into a series of frozen fortresses. Divisions entrenched themselves in villages, churches, and schoolhouses, using the ruins as improvised bunkers. Engineers built defensive belts of trenches, barbed wire, and minefields, while soldiers set booby traps in abandoned houses. These tactics slowed the Soviet advance and inflicted heavy casualties on attackers. One of the bloodiest engagements of this phase occurred in the Rzhev-Vyazma sector, where the Soviet 29th and 39th Armies attempted to encircle German forces, holding the vital supply corridor west of Moscow. The battle raged from January through February 1942, turning into a brutal attritional struggle fought in blizzards and darkness. Both sides suffered catastrophic losses. The Soviets lost over 270,000 men in this operation alone, while German casualties reached approximately 120,000. Despite initial Soviet breakthroughs, the encirclement failed, and the front stabilized along a line that would remain contested for the next 15 months. Further south, near Yukhnov and Oral, Soviet forces achieved mixed results. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army, though battered, managed to hold the key transport hubs through a combination of disciplined defense and superior coordination. Soviet assaults, lacking synchronized artillery support, repeatedly broke down under machine gun and mortar fire. In several sectors, Soviet troops froze to death in open fields after failed night attacks. These failures exposed the limits of the Red Army's recovery. Its morale was high, but its tactical proficiency and logistics were still developing. Meanwhile, the Soviet Air Force struggled to operate in the harsh winter environment. Icing on aircraft wings and limited daylight restricted operations to a few hours per day. Despite this, Soviet aviation managed to disrupt German supply routes, particularly targeting rail lines between Smolensk and Vyazma. On the ground, partisan activity intensified further behind German lines. By February, over 100,000 partisans operated in Belarus and the western Russian forests, destroying bridges, ambushing convoys, and gathering intelligence. Their actions forced the Wehrmacht to divert entire divisions to security duties, further weakening its combat capability at the front. Stalin, however, was dissatisfied with the pace of the advance. Convinced that the enemy could still be destroyed, he ordered a continuation of offensive operations through February and March, despite protests from his commanders. Zhukov and Konev warned that their troops were exhausted and undersupplied, but Stalin refused to relent. The result was a series of ill-prepared attacks that yielded minimal gains at enormous cost. Entire divisions dwindled to a few hundred men. Frostbite and starvation once again became as deadly as bullets. By the end of February 1942, the winter counteroffensive had achieved its immediate objective. The defense of Moscow was secure, and the German advance had been decisively halted. However, the attempt to transform that victory into a strategic breakthrough had failed. The Red Army had pushed the Germans back up to 250 kilometers, but at the price of over 1 million casualties across all fronts. The Germans, though bloodied and retreating, retained control of key communication centers and defensive lines. Both armies now stood locked in a frozen stalemate, their strength exhausted, their soldiers buried under the snow. The battle for Moscow was over, but its consequences would shape the remainder of the war. The myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility had been shattered, and for the first time since 1939, Hitler's armies were forced onto the defensive. Yet the cost of that first Soviet victory was immense, and both sides would spend the spring of 1942 rebuilding for what everyone knew would come next, a new and even more terrible campaign. As the winter of 1941-1942 gave way to spring, the front west of Moscow had settled into a fragile stalemate. Operation Typhoon had failed, and the Wehrmacht, once the unstoppable conqueror of Europe, now clung to survival in the frozen expanses of the Soviet Union. The Red Army, though victorious in defense, was exhausted and decimated. Both sides needed time and resources to recover. What followed was a season of reconstruction, reassessment, and preparation for the campaigns that would define the war's second year. For the German High Command, the outcome of the Moscow offensive demanded immediate revision of strategy. Hitler, unwilling to acknowledge the scale of the disaster, blamed the generals for cowardice and defeatism. In January 1942, he dismissed Brauchitsch as commander-in-chief of the army and assumed direct control himself. This decision centralized power under the Führer's personal authority, but eroded the professional autonomy of the general staff. Operational planning, once the domain of experienced field officers, was now driven by Hitler's intuition and ideology. Army Group Center was ordered to hold its current positions at all costs, despite the risk of encirclement. Withdrawals, even tactical ones, were strictly forbidden. The consequences were immediate. In the Rzew-Vyazma sector, several German divisions found themselves surrounded during the Soviet January offensive. Instead of authorizing an organized withdrawal, Hitler demanded that they fight to the last man. The 6th and 23rd Infantry Divisions lost nearly half their strength before relief forces broke through in late February. This marked the first instance of a recurring pattern that would later define the Eastern Front, Hitler's refusal to yield ground, no matter how untenable the position. Yet despite heavy losses, the Wehrmacht managed to stabilize its front lines. By March 1942, German defenses extended in a wide arc from Lake Ilmen in the north to Orel in the south, anchored by fortified strongpoints at Rzew, Vyazma, and Bryansk. The Red Army's situation was no less precarious. The winter victories had come at a staggering price. Entire divisions were reduced to skeleton formations, and many units lacked even basic supplies. Ammunition was rationed, and soldiers often fought with captured German weapons. Frostbite, malnutrition, and disease claimed thousands of lives long after the fighting had subsided. Industrial output, despite being relocated east of the Urals, struggled to keep pace with the demands of the front. The factories of Sverdlovsk, Chelyabinsk, and Magnitogorsk produced tanks and artillery in record numbers, but transportation bottlenecks and fuel shortages limited their delivery. The Red Army in early 1942 was vast, determined, and rebuilding, but still uneven in quality. The spring thaw brought new challenges. As temperatures rose, the snow melted into deep mud, paralyzing movement across the entire front. The infamous Rasputitsa returned, transforming roads into rivers of sludge. Vehicles sank axle-deep, and supply convoys stalled for days. For both armies, mobility was nearly impossible. The Germans called this period the time of the mud, when even horses could not move. Commanders on both sides used the enforced lull to reorganize. Soviet engineers repaired rail lines leading to Kaluga and Tula, while German units rebuilt their depleted armored divisions. It was during this pause that Hitler and the OKH, Army High Command, formulated their next strategic objective, Operation Blue, Fall Blau. The plan abandoned Moscow as the primary goal and shifted the focus southward to the oil fields of the Caucasus and the Volga River. The reasoning was clear. Germany's war machine depended on fuel, and the losses of 1941 had stretched its resources to the brink. Capturing the oil of Maikop, Grozny, and Baku, along with cutting Soviet supply routes via Stalingrad, would theoretically cripple the Red Army and force the USSR into collapse. To achieve this, Hitler ordered Army Group South to be massively reinforced at the expense of Army Group Center. For the Soviets, intelligence reports indicated renewed German preparations, but the exact direction of the offensive remained unclear. Stalin, still wary of another attack on Moscow, ordered the Western and Kalinin fronts to maintain a strong defensive posture while launching limited local offensives to keep pressure on the Germans. The resulting battles in the spring of 1942, particularly the Soviet offensives near Rzhev, Demyansk, and Orel, consumed hundreds of thousands of lives without producing decisive results. The so-called Rzhev meat grinder would later become one of the bloodiest and least known chapters of the war, claiming over 1 million Soviet casualties between 1942 and 1943. At the same time, the Red Army underwent significant structural reforms. The Stavka reorganized its command system, introducing new fronts and standardizing coordination between armor, artillery, and infantry. The lessons of 1941 had been painfully learned. Mobility, communications, and logistics would now determine success. Soviet tank production increased rapidly. The T-34, KV-1, and new T-60 models became the backbone of armored forces. Training programs improved, though experience still varied widely among newly mobilized troops. Soviet morale, despite immense losses, remained high. The defense of Moscow had proven that the Wehrmacht could be stopped. In contrast, morale within the German army was deteriorating. Letters and diaries from soldiers reveal a growing sense of disillusionment. What had been sold as a swift crusade against Bolshevism had turned into an endless war of attrition. The troops suffered not only from fatigue, but also from the psychological toll of the winter defeat. Replacements arriving from Germany lacked combat experience and often succumbed quickly to the harsh conditions. The Wehrmacht's logistical system, designed for rapid offensives, struggled to sustain prolonged defensive operations. Fuel shortages persisted, and food rations were cut. By April 1942, the snow had melted, and the steppe began to dry. German and Soviet reconnaissance units once again probed the front lines, signaling the approaching end of the winter pause. Both sides prepared for the next stage of the struggle, though their objectives diverged sharply. For Hitler, the war's future lay in the south, where he believed victory would restore momentum and resources. For Stalin, the path forward required holding Moscow at all costs, while striking wherever German weakness appeared. The front was quiet for now, but beneath the surface, both empires were rebuilding their strength, ready to test once more the endurance of men and machines on the vast and unforgiving plains of Russia. The Battle of Moscow had ended, but its legacy defined the year ahead. It marked the first true turning point of the Second World War, proving that the German advance could be halted and that total war would demand not only armies but entire nations mobilized for survival. As the thawed earth gave way to spring, the Eastern Front stood poised between exhaustion and escalation, a fragile calm before the next storm. By the summer of 1942, the scars of the failed drive on Moscow were still visible across the front. Burned-out vehicles, shattered towns, and the unburied remains of soldiers marked the line where Operation Typhoon had met its end. Yet neither side saw this as closure. For Hitler, the setback before Moscow was to be avenged. For Stalin, It was proof that endurance could outlast any enemy. The struggle that began in the snows of 1941 had transformed into a continental war of resources, logistics, and willpower. Both empires now sought to recover from the destruction wrought by the battle for the Soviet capital. The German army's reorganization during the first half of 1942 reflected both desperation and adaptation. The losses sustained during the winter campaign, estimated at 750,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, had gutted entire formations. Reinforcements arrived, but many were undertrained replacements, drawn from newly mobilized classes or occupied territories. The Luftwaffe, which had once dominated the skies, was also stretched thin after continuous operations. Nevertheless, Hitler demanded another offensive to regain the initiative and erase the humiliation of the Moscow failure. The Wehrmacht's leadership promised that the new plan, focused on the southern front, would avoid the mistakes of 1941 by targeting economic rather than symbolic objectives. Army Group Center, the formation that had spearheaded Operation Typhoon, was ordered to transition to a defensive posture. Its mission was to hold the vast territory captured during the previous year's advance, secure the vital railway junctions at Smolensk and Bryansk, and absorb any Soviet attacks. The troops stationed there lived under constant pressure. Defensive warfare was alien to the Wehrmacht's doctrine, which had always prioritized mobility and offense. Trenches, bunkers, and minefields replaced the rapid maneuvers of the early campaigns. Divisions dug in deeply, building what would become one of the most fortified sectors of the entire Eastern Front. The Rzhev salient, a protruding bulge of German-held territory west of Moscow, became both a shield and a trap, an exposed position vulnerable to encirclement but vital for threatening the Soviet capital. The Soviet command, aware of German weaknesses in the center, continued to treat the Moscow region as a strategic priority. Throughout 1942, the Western and Kalinin fronts launched a series of offensives against the Rzhev and Vyazma sectors, hoping to destroy Army Group Center's core divisions. The battles were relentless and attritional, often fought in forests and swamps that negated the advantage of German armor. Soviet units, bolstered by newly trained recruits and fresh equipment, advanced repeatedly, only to be repelled with heavy casualties. The fighting was so intense that German soldiers dubbed the region the meat grinder, while Soviet veterans referred to it as the Rzhev nightmare. Between January and December 1942, the Red Army lost more than 1 million men in these operations, while German casualties exceeded 330,000. Despite the carnage, both sides continued to adapt. The Red Army, learning from its costly assaults, improved its coordination of artillery, armor, and infantry. Centralized command gave way to more flexible tactics at the divisional level. Soviet engineers constructed pontoon bridges across the Volga and Dnieper tributaries to improve mobility, while supply trains from the Urals delivered a steady stream of T-34 tanks and Katyusha rocket launchers. By mid-1942, Soviet industry had surpassed pre-war production levels, an achievement made possible by the massive evacuation of factories in 1941. Moscow's defense was no longer a desperate reaction. It had become part of a planned, sustained war effort. For the Wehrmacht, holding the Central Front drained vital resources from the southern offensive that would later culminate at Stalingrad. Each trainload of ammunition or reinforcements sent to Rzhev was one less for the troops advancing toward the Volga. Still, Hitler refused to abandon the salient, viewing it as both a psychological symbol and a forward base for a future renewed push toward Moscow. Generals such as Model and Klug, tasked with holding the line, developed sophisticated defensive systems that absorbed Soviet assaults with elastic resistance. Villages were converted into strongpoints, surrounded by minefields, and supported by interlocking artillery positions. These defenses foreshadowed the static warfare that would dominate the Eastern Front in later years. In Moscow itself, life remained defined by austerity and vigilance. Although the immediate threat of invasion had passed, the city was still within range of Luftwaffe bombers. Air raids continued intermittently throughout 1942, targeting rail yards and factories. Blackouts were strictly enforced, and anti-aircraft batteries ringed the capital. Yet morale was higher than at any point since the start of the war. Propaganda emphasized resilience and unity, portraying Moscow as both fortress and heart of the Soviet state. Posters proclaimed, "We defended Moscow. Now we will liberate the motherland." Stalin's government held parades and commemorations, reinforcing the idea that the defense of the city marked a sacred victory for the entire nation. Behind the front, the Soviet war machine operated at full capacity. The relocated industries in the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia now produced hundreds of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces each month. Workers lived in primitive conditions, but were driven by patriotic zeal and strict discipline. Women made up a growing portion of the labor force, filling roles once occupied by men. The connection between Moscow's survival and the vast industrial network stretching across the USSR became one of the defining features of the Soviet war effort. Every shipment of steel or fuel that arrived at the front was a reminder that the defense of the capital had not been in vain. Yet beneath the surface of Soviet confidence lay deep exhaustion. The Red Army had held the line, but at a staggering human cost. Villages around Moscow remained in ruins, and entire regions were depopulated. The countryside was scarred by trenches, burned forests, and unmarked graves. Civilians returned to their homes only to find nothing left. Hunger persisted, and rationing continued in the capital. The price of victory was visible in every shattered street and every silent field. By the end of 1942, the Battle of Moscow had faded from the headlines, overshadowed by the unfolding struggle at Stalingrad. But for those who had fought there, it remained the defining experience of the war, the place where the Wehrmacht's myth of invincibility first broke and where the Soviet Union proved it could survive. Both armies now faced a new reality. The conflict had become one of annihilation, not maneuver, a contest of endurance, not speed. The front that began with Operation Typhoon would continue to consume men and machines for years to come, long after the snow that stopped Hitler's empire had melted into the soil of Russia. By early 1943, the aftermath of the Moscow campaign had reshaped the balance of power on the Eastern Front. Operation Typhoon's failure had marked the end of German strategic initiative in the north and center, forcing the Wehrmacht to adjust its ambitions to the harsh realities of total war. The Soviet Union, once on the brink of destruction, now stood emboldened, its armies growing in both size and confidence. The battle for Moscow was not only a military turning point, it was a test of endurance that permanently altered the course of the conflict. Yet, the consequences of that brutal winter extended far beyond the battlefield, influencing every aspect of the war that followed. The Wehrmacht entered 1943 as a force transformed but weakened. The previous year had exposed the limits of blitzkrieg. The combination of distance, logistics, and climate had proven insurmountable, and the failure to take Moscow shattered German illusions of quick victory. Operation Blue in the south had produced initial success, but its overextension would lead to the catastrophe at Stalingrad. The German army, now fighting defensive battles across thousands of kilometers, struggled to maintain cohesion. Army Group Center remained fixed along the Rzhev-Vyazma line, its divisions depleted yet forbidden to withdraw. Hitler's insistence on holding every meter of ground condemned hundreds of thousands of troops to months of attrition warfare. The Soviet High Command, meanwhile, viewed the Central Front as both a defensive bulwark and a strategic anvil. The Rzhev salient, that massive wedge of German-held territory pointing toward Moscow, was a constant threat, but also an opportunity. Zhukov, Konev, and Rokossovsky each proposed operations to reduce it. Between 1942 and early 1943, the Red Army launched a series of coordinated assaults, known collectively as the Rzhev-Vyazma operations. The fighting was relentless, often taking place in blinding snowstorms or mud-soaked fields. Soviet infantry advanced through barbed wire and minefields under heavy artillery fire, while German machine guns mowed down waves of attackers. Entire divisions were wiped out in a single day's assault, but the pressure never ceased. In March 1943, the German command finally authorized a limited withdrawal from the salient. Operation Buffalo was launched to shorten the front and free reserves for other sectors. Over 250,000 troops and 1,000 tanks retreated systematically from Rzhev and Vyazma toward Smolensk, destroying infrastructure and evacuating civilians to deny resources to the Soviets. The withdrawal, executed with precision, avoided encirclement, but came at a moral cost. It symbolized the end of German hopes of a renewed advance on Moscow. The once proud spearhead of Barbarossa had been reduced to a defensive bastion, its armies exhausted and its commanders disillusioned. For the Soviets, the retaking of Rzhev and Vyazma in March 1943 was a victory of immense psychological importance. It marked the first time since the winter of 1941 that Moscow's western approaches were completely secure. The Red Army entered the ruined towns to find only devastation. Entire neighborhoods burned, wells poisoned, and roads mined. Civilian survivors emerged from cellars and forests, their faces gaunt from starvation. Soviet war correspondents described cities without voices, silent reminders of what the German advance had cost. Yet, amidst the ruins, the sense of triumph was unmistakable. The victory symbolized the reversal of fortune that had begun with Operation Typhoon's failure. The logistical foundation of both armies now revealed the true nature of modern warfare. For the Wehrmacht, supply lines stretched from Germany through Poland and Belarus to the front, a network of over 1,200 kilometers. Constant partisan activity along these routes disrupted movement, forcing the Germans to divert tens of thousands of men to rear area security duties. Soviet partisans, now organized under Central Command, conducted coordinated attacks on bridges, fuel depots, and rail junctions. Between January and June 1943, they destroyed over 1,500 trains and 3,000 kilometers of rail track. The result was catastrophic delays in the delivery of ammunition, food, and replacements. In contrast, the Soviet logistical apparatus had matured. Railways restored after the Battle of Moscow connected the capital with the Urals, Central Asia, and Siberia. New industrial cities, such as Magnitogorsk and Sverdlovsk, operated at full capacity, supplying the Red Army with tanks, aircraft, and artillery in unprecedented quantities. The T-34 became the symbol of Soviet industrial efficiency. Simple to produce, reliable in combat, and capable of operating in conditions that immobilized German machinery. By mid-1943, the Soviet Union was producing twice as many tanks and 3 times as many artillery pieces as Germany. The economic transformation, achieved while under constant threat, was one of the most remarkable achievements of the war. The human toll, however, remained immense. The areas once occupied by the Wehrmacht revealed a landscape of suffering. Mass graves were uncovered, containing both civilians and prisoners of war. Entire villages had been erased during the retreat. The winter of 1941-42 had not only claimed soldiers, but millions of civilians caught between the lines. As the Red Army advanced, field tribunals documented atrocities committed by German security units and SS detachments. These reports, compiled in Moscow, became crucial evidence for wartime propaganda and later for post-war trials. The Battle of Moscow, once a purely military event, had evolved into a symbol of moral endurance against annihilation. In the political sphere, the outcome of the Moscow campaign strengthened Stalin's authority beyond challenge. The survival of the capital allowed him to present himself as both the architect of victory and the embodiment of national unity. The Soviet state, previously fractured by panic and evacuation, now consolidated around a narrative of heroic resistance. New medals and orders were established to commemorate the defenders of Moscow. The defense of the city was presented not merely as a battle, but as the turning point of civilization itself, a theme that Soviet propaganda would repeat for decades. By the middle of 1943, both sides stood at a crossroads. The Germans, reeling from defeat at Stalingrad, prepared for a massive counteroffensive at Kursk in hopes of regaining the initiative. The Soviets, buoyed by their victories and secure in their central front, awaited the German attack with confidence. The front around Moscow, once the epicenter of the war, had become a fortress of stability and supply, a base from which future Soviet offensives would be launched. The Battle of Moscow had begun as an act of desperation. It ended as the cornerstone of Soviet recovery. Operation Typhoon was meant to destroy the Soviet Union in a single blow. Instead, it destroyed the illusion of German invincibility. The snow, the cold, and the will of a nation had stopped Hitler's empire at the gates of its most important prize. What followed was no longer a war of conquest, but a war of survival. For both sides, a conflict where the outcome would be written not by the generals, but by the endurance of millions who refused to break under the weight of history. By the beginning of 1943, the front lines west of Moscow had stabilized into a vast, fortified network of trenches, pillboxes, and minefields. The failure of Operation Typhoon was no longer a temporary setback. It had become the dividing line between the era of German expansion and the long retreat that would eventually end in Berlin. For the Wehrmacht, the losses suffered before the gates of Moscow represented not only a tactical failure, but also a psychological rupture. The dream of a quick, decisive victory in the East had vanished beneath the snows of 1941, and what replaced it was a war of attrition that the German economy and manpower reserves were ill-suited to sustain. Within the German high command, the debate over what went wrong continued long after the guns fell silent. Some officers blamed the onset of winter and the logistical difficulties of operating so far from supply bases. Others pointed to the Soviet capacity for reinforcement, underestimated by nearly every intelligence estimate. But among Hitler's inner circle, the Führer's own interpretation dominated. He insisted that his generals had failed to show the necessary willpower. This belief hardened into doctrine. From 1942 onward, withdrawal became synonymous with defeatism, and positional defense became a political obligation. The seeds of later disasters, Stalingrad, Kursk, and the encirclements in Ukraine, were planted in those post-Moscow recriminations. The consequences of this mindset were visible everywhere along the front. The troops of Army Group Center were ordered to hold their positions indefinitely, even as their numbers dwindled. Reinforcements were scarce. Artillery shells were rationed. The once mobile panzer divisions were now tied to static sectors, functioning more as fire brigades than spearheads. Commanders improvised. Field workshops repaired tanks cannibalized from wrecks, while captured Soviet equipment was repurposed. Yet morale steadily eroded. Soldiers wrote home of endless cold, lice, and fear of encirclement. For many, the war no longer seemed winnable, only survivable. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union had learned the central lesson of 1941. Survival required not only courage, but organization. In the months following the Moscow counteroffensive, the Red Army transformed itself into an industrial and logistical machine. The relocation of factories east of the Urals had borne fruit. Entire production complexes now operated beyond the reach of German bombers. The T-34 tank, which had stunned the Germans during Typhoon, was being built in such quantities that by the end of 1942, the Soviets had fielded over 15,000 of them. Aviation output soared as well, giving the VVS a growing advantage in numbers. The Moscow front, once the focal point of invasion, became the heart of Soviet command and coordination. New military academies were established in the capital to train officers in combined arms tactics, replacing the rigid doctrine of mass assault with more flexible operational planning. Logistics lines radiated from Moscow to every front, allowing rapid movement of reinforcements and materiel. The experiences of the winter campaign were studied in detail: how frost had immobilized machinery, how supply routes had failed, and how communications had broken down under enemy air attack. These studies directly influenced Soviet planning for later offensives, including the counterstrokes at Stalingrad and Kursk. Beyond the purely military realm, the Battle of Moscow reshaped the political and social fabric of the Soviet Union. Stalin's decision to remain in the city during the crisis of October 1941 had elevated his status to near mythical proportions. His speeches in Red Square, broadcast over the radio even as shells fell on the outskirts, became a symbol of national endurance. After the German retreat, this symbolism was institutionalized. Moscow was celebrated as the city that defeated fascism. Streets and squares were renamed, monuments erected, and commemorations held annually. The victory became not only a military triumph, but a central pillar of Soviet identity. For civilians, however, the scars were deep and lasting. Entire districts of Moscow and the surrounding oblast were destroyed. Thousands of homes had been razed during the battle. Factories had been dismantled and evacuated. The city's population had dropped from over 4 million in 1940 to barely half that by 1942. Those who remained endured constant shortages, rationing, and nightly blackouts. The memory of air raids and executions, of burned villages and empty trains heading east, never faded. Even after the threat of invasion passed, the shadow of 1941 lingered over every household. The German defeat before Moscow also carried international repercussions. Until that winter, the Wehrmacht had appeared unstoppable. The rapid conquests of Poland, France, and the Balkans had convinced much of the world that Nazi Germany possessed an unbeatable military system. The collapse of Typhoon shattered that illusion. Allied governments in London and Washington drew new conclusions about Soviet endurance. The victory at Moscow encouraged greater coordination within the Grand Alliance and led to the acceleration of Lend-Lease deliveries through the Arctic convoys. Supplies of trucks, aircraft, and food soon reached Soviet ports, small at first, but symbolically vital. In Berlin, by contrast, the loss of prestige was devastating. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels worked frantically to conceal the magnitude of the defeat, framing the retreat as a strategic regrouping in the face of weather conditions. German newspapers emphasized the heroic endurance of troops on the Eastern Front, while downplaying the abandonment of offensive goals. But among officers and soldiers alike, the truth was obvious. The war that had begun as a lightning strike had become an endless struggle in the snow. The myth of invincibility, once the Wehrmacht's greatest weapon, was gone. By the end of 1943, the lines that had once marked the limits of Operation Typhoon were far behind the new front. Smolensk, once the gateway to Moscow for German armor, was retaken by Soviet forces in September. The Red Army had advanced more than 200 kilometers westward, reclaiming the ground it had lost in 1941. Yet even as Moscow stood secure, the memory of that desperate winter persisted in Soviet strategy. Every offensive thereafter carried echoes of Typhoon, the obsession with preparation, the reliance on overwhelming reserves, and the insistence on logistical depth. Operation Typhoon had begun as the culmination of Germany's grand design for the East. It ended as the moment that design unraveled. The Wehrmacht, once a force of mobility and precision, was dragged into a war of endurance against an opponent that could not be broken. The Red Army, once disorganized and reeling, had emerged as a disciplined, industrialized power. The snow outside Moscow had done more than stop Hitler's empire. It had frozen the momentum of conquest itself, turning the tide of the greatest war in history. In the years that followed, the Battle of Moscow became more than just a chapter of military history. It became a defining legend of the 20th century. Its consequences rippled far beyond the borders of the Soviet Union, influencing global strategy, propaganda, and the psychology of modern warfare. Operation Typhoon, launched with the belief that one last push could destroy the Red Army and end the Eastern Campaign, instead revealed the fatal limitations of the German war machine. The defeat before Moscow was the first irreversible fracture in Hitler's empire, a failure of planning, logistics, and ideology that would echo in every subsequent campaign. From a purely military standpoint, the lessons of the Moscow offensive were immense. The German high command had underestimated every variable that mattered: distance, terrain, weather, and above all, Soviet resilience. The assumption that the USSR would collapse after the fall of major cities proved catastrophically wrong. The Wehrmacht's reliance on rapid encirclements dependent on functioning roads and supply columns, collapsed as autumn turned to winter. Temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. Lubricants froze, weapons jammed, and soldiers perished from frostbite faster than from enemy fire. Tens of thousands of horses, still vital to German logistics, died in the cold, cutting off ammunition and food deliveries. For an army trained in maneuver warfare, the inability to move became synonymous with defeat. The Soviet Union, conversely, proved capable of adapting under extreme pressure. The relocation of 1,500 factories eastward had saved the country's industrial base, ensuring a steady flow of tanks, artillery, and rifles, even as entire cities lay in ruins. The centralization of command under Stalin and the Stavka allowed for a unified strategic response. For the first time in the war, the Red Army coordinated large-scale defensive operations with reserves in depth, using the vastness of the country as a weapon. The counteroffensive launched in December 1941, though costly, demonstrated the strategic potential of the Soviet system, its ability to absorb punishment, rebuild, and strike back. The human cost, however, was staggering on both sides. Between September 1941 and April 1942, the combined casualties around Moscow exceeded 2 million, over 1 million Soviet soldiers killed, wounded, or missing, and roughly 600,000 German and Axis troops lost in action. Entire divisions disappeared in the snow, their names erased from the rolls. Civilians paid an even higher price. Villages caught between advancing and retreating armies were burned to the ground. In the Moscow region alone, an estimated 80,000 civilians died from starvation, exposure, and occupation-related violence. Behind the front lines, reprisals, deportations, and executions added to the tally of suffering. The battle for Moscow was not just a military event, it was a humanitarian catastrophe of immense proportions. Politically, the failure of Operation Typhoon marked a turning point in the Nazi regime's internal dynamics. The trust between Hitler and his generals, already strained, broke down completely. Field Marshal von Bock was dismissed, followed by a series of purges and command reshuffles. Hitler began to assume direct control over operational planning, sidelining the professional staff of the General Stab. This centralization of authority, rooted in paranoia and ideology, ensured that future German campaigns would repeat many of the same strategic errors. Overextension, disregard for logistics, and refusal to retreat until annihilation. For the Soviet Union, the victory at Moscow had the opposite effect. Stalin's authority, which had wavered during the summer of 1941, solidified into absolute power. The success was portrayed as a triumph of leadership and socialist discipline. The defense of Moscow became a national myth, the moment when the Great Patriotic War was born. Propaganda films, books, and monuments immortalized the battle, presenting it as the struggle of ordinary citizens who rose to defend their homeland against an existential threat. In the post-war decades, this narrative would become central to Soviet identity, shaping how generations understood sacrifice, endurance, and victory. Internationally, the implications were profound. Before the winter of 1941, many in Britain and the United States doubted the Soviet Union's ability to survive. The defense of Moscow changed that perception overnight. Reports from correspondents on the front, combined with German admissions of retreat, convinced Allied governments that the USSR could hold out. This confidence underpinned the first major deliveries of Lend-Lease aid, including trucks, locomotives, and aircraft that would later prove essential to Soviet offensives. The global narrative shifted. The Red Army was no longer a doomed force, but a partner in the fight against fascism. The memory of Operation Typhoon lingered among German veterans long after the war. For many, it represented the moment they first sensed defeat, when faith in the Reich's invincibility began to crumble. Letters and diaries recovered after the conflict revealed the growing despair. Soldiers wrote of endless cold, hunger, and disbelief that Moscow had slipped from their grasp after being so close. They spoke of frozen comrades buried under snow, of tanks that would not start, of orders to advance when the road itself had disappeared. The once proud Wehrmacht, symbol of precision and power, had been reduced to exhaustion and chaos. In Moscow, life slowly returned to normalcy after the battle, but the scars were visible everywhere. Bombed-out buildings stood alongside makeshift shelters, railways were rebuilt, factories restarted, and the dead buried in mass graves along the city's outskirts. The capital, which had faced the full force of Germany's invasion, now became the epicenter of Soviet reconstruction. Every year, parades on Red Square reminded the population of what had been achieved, and at what cost. The battle's anniversary became sacred, symbolizing the moment when the Soviet people had turned despair into defiance. In the broader course of World War II, Operation Typhoon marked the first decisive German defeat. It shattered the myth of the Wehrmacht's unstoppable momentum and exposed the strategic flaw at the heart of Hitler's vision: the belief that ideological will could overcome geography, climate, and the industrial strength of a continent-sized adversary. The winter of 1941-42 was not merely a season, it was the moment when the tide of history began to shift. When historians look back at the Eastern Front, the story of Moscow stands as the hinge of fate, the point where the German Empire reached its zenith and began to collapse. The snow-covered fields that swallowed entire armies became a graveyard not just for men, but for an idea: that domination could be achieved through speed, violence, and fear. The winter that stopped Hitler's empire would come to symbolize the endurance of a nation and the beginning of the long road to Berlin, a road that began irrevocably in the frozen earth outside Moscow.